One of my biggest fears has always been heights and the fear of flying. I've always been afraid of heights, and as a result, I'm scared to fly too. And I'll be honest, I know it's pretty irrational because people fly every single day. I know they're really safe, they're much safer than driving a car, which I do all the time. But even still, whenever I board a plane, I do find myself worrying about what could go wrong. I think part of it is because of what you see on TV and the news. Every now and again, planes do crash, and even if it is very rare, the outcome is typically extremely tragic. Nobody ever survives. But there are stories, though, of people in a plane crash, and against all odds, there is a survivor. And today, we have a story about just that. We have a young woman who's flying with her mom. The plane does encounter bad weather and ends up crashing. As you'll find out, though, surviving that plane crash was just the beginning of her nightmare. Now, before we jump into this story, though, if you are a fan of this type of content, if you enjoy stories about things that are either weird and creepy, difficult to explain, or in some cases just outright terrifying, well, you are in the right place because I love this type of content too, but more than anything, I love sharing it with you. So whether you are here for the very first time or you're back for another one, I want to thank you truly, madly, and deeply for being here, and I hope sincerely that you enjoy this story and many more to come. Now, with that said, though, let's jump right into it. We have a story of a lone plane crash survivor. Please keep in mind there are some sensitive and graphic details here, so viewer discretion is advised. On Christmas Eve 1971, 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke and her mother were flying from Lima to Pucallpa, Peru. Like many others, they were traveling for the holidays, and they were flying aboard LANSA Flight 508. Now, this flight had 92 people in total. There was 86 passengers, plus members of the crew. Anyone who's traveled at all during the holidays knows how stressful it can be. You have this strong desire and urge to visit your family and your loved ones, and you have so many people traveling in such a short period of time that it creates a really hectic situation for both the people traveling and also too for the airlines as well. There's this pressure to satisfy that demand and to get people to and from their destinations that oftentimes it may lead to traveling in less than safe conditions. As a matter of fact, in their post-flight investigation, they did come to the conclusion that this flight intentionally flew into bad weather, perhaps to keep up with that pressure and demand to get people to their final destination. The flight from Lima to Pucallpa is not very long. It's only about an hour and 15 minutes, but it does involve flying directly over the Peruvian rainforest, which itself is part of the Amazon rainforest. Now, the Amazon is the largest in the world. It covers much of Brazil. It extends into Venezuela, parts of Colombia, and then down into Peru. And Pucallpa is one of the biggest cities within that region. It lies on the banks of the Ucayali River, which itself is a tributary of the Amazon River. So you have here a very tropical climate, and it is the month of December. So this is the hottest month of the year, and it also is one of the highest amounts of rainfall and precipitation. So here you have a case where there is the chance of very extreme weather, and just as important, there's a chance that weather can change very suddenly and dramatically, and that did come into play with this flight. Shortly after taking off, it became readily apparent that they were flying directly into a rapidly developing thunder system, and as the plane began to make its ascent, the weather got progressively worse. Now, if only they had been able to reach their cruising altitude, maybe they would have been above the worst of this storm, and perhaps that was part of the rationale in taking off in the first place. Maybe they figured that if they could get ahead of this storm, they'd be okay, but unfortunately that was not the case, and they found themselves stuck in the middle of this massive thunderstorm. At an altitude of around 20,000 feet, that's when the weather really began to take a turn for the worse as this storm intensified. The plane is now being subjected to severe and violent turbulence to the point where it's rising and falling dramatically. The overhead bins in the cabin, those are now opening up. You have luggage flying, you have Christmas presents flying, everything is being strewn about. And as this is all happening, the mood and the atmosphere on the plane with the passengers is quickly deteriorating as well. Everybody is now extremely panicked. Juliane and her mom are basically frozen in fear as there is this stark realization that they are now in this very perilous situation because of this violent storm. Not long after this turbulence, the situation becomes even more dire because the passengers look out the window and they see that at this point now, they are right in the middle of the storm because there's lightning strikes happening all around the aircraft. And it's at this moment that Juliane turns to her mom And her mom says in this very chilling voice that this is it, this is the end. And it's those horrifying words that were the very last thing Juliane would ever hear her mom say, because just a moment later, the plane is struck by lightning. LANSA Flight 508 has just been struck by lightning, and right afterwards there's a fire now on the plane. So between the lightning strike, the fire on board, and the weather itself, the plane is now crashing down towards Earth. It's now nosediving down to the jungle below. And one of the things that was most striking to me as I learned about this harrowing tale is how Juliane recalled the difference in sounds when all this was happening. At first you have the panicking and the screaming and the terror on board the plane itself, and then you have a loud strike, the loud explosion that happened as the plane started to fall to Earth and broke apart. The next thing you know, Juliane only recalls hearing the whistling of the wind as the seat she was in plummeted down to what was surely going to be a certain death. So the plane is broken apart, and one of the things that happened when the plane broke apart was Juliane's seat and the two attached to it got jettisoned off from the aircraft. They were flung from the aircraft, and many attribute that fact to one of the things that allowed her to survive this hellacious fall. She was still strapped into her seat, and the two attached to it were almost falling as a unit, and those things happening in conjunction with one another slowed her descent just enough, and also too provided a cushion that she wasn't killed upon impact. But as you can expect, she comes crashing down through the rainforest below, through the jungle canopy. She recalled seeing it as she was falling and describing it as green cauliflower or broccoli as she fell down to the jungle below and came crashing through it. Now, as you could expect, she suffered a myriad of injuries from this. She wasn't killed on impact, but she suffered a lot of injuries from this fall. She had numerous broken bones. She had a broken collarbone, a fractured shin. She also found out later on that she had a torn ligament in her knee, not to mention bumps, bruises, a concussion, and a bunch of cuts and lacerations that in this type of biome, the risk of infection is extremely high. So while she survived the fall, she suffered a number of injuries, and she found herself alone in the jungle. So at this point, Juliane has fallen from roughly 3 kilometers in the sky, and somehow, against all odds, she survived this. She's done the unthinkable. She has survived a plane crash, but she now finds herself stranded alone in the jungle. The force from the pressure change from when she was in the cabin to when she got ejected from the aircraft and fell has caused the capillaries in her eyes to burst, and her eyes are almost swollen shut. And it took the better part of a day, on Christmas Day, for her to gather up enough strength and heal enough to even be able to stand. So she's in a situation now where she survived a plane crash, but she's alone in the jungle. And her first reaction wasn't to think about herself, it was to call out for her mom. And it's such a heartbreaking thing to think about. A young girl alone in the jungle, and her first reaction is not about herself, it's about, where's my mom at? Is she safe? And that to me was such a powerful thing to read about, and to put myself in that situation is unimaginable. But that was her first thought, is where's my mom at? I need to find my mom. So Juliane musters up enough strength to stand, and in her case, she was actually better equipped to survive this scenario than most people. She had a lot of skills and knowledge about this area because her parents actually had a research station in the rainforest. So she spent a lot of time here, and she knew about a lot of the dangers, but she also too knew about some of the things that would give her the best possible chance to be rescued. So she knew that she was much better off finding a body of water. So she set out to find a stream or a river, and that came with a number of benefits. First and foremost, if she's going to find anybody else or any survivors, there's a good chance they're going to make their way to the water as well. You have this being the main means of transportation in the rainforest is going to be by boat, by river, and that's where she's going to have the best chance of finding anybody else. Along with that, too, is the fact that traveling along a stream is going to be much easier. If she's walking along the riverbank, it'll be much easier for her to make ground and make time versus being in the jungle. It's so dense that she has no tools or resources. She has no machete to make a path for herself. So if she's finding a river and walking along that, it'll be much easier to traverse. Beyond that, too, is the simple fact that if she's on the river, she can travel one direction and there's very little chance that she'll get lost. If she's in the middle of the jungle, you can become disorientated and you will not be able to find your way as easily if you're traveling in one direction along the river. So she set forward to try to find a river, and it took her a few days, but eventually she did. So it takes her a few days, but eventually she does find a body of water. She finds a stream, and it's during this arduous trek that eventually she comes across wreckage from the plane. So keep in mind, her seat got thrown off in the distance and didn't land in the same vicinity, but it's during this trek through the jungle to try to find a stream that she comes across some wreckage from the plane. She knows she has to look there to try to find some type of food. Keep in mind, she has no food, she has very little in the way of resources, and anything she can find will help her survive. But she also has this fear and trepidation because she doesn't know what she's going to come across. Is she going to see bodies? Is she going to find her mom? And it's during this investigation that she notices in the distance there is a section of seats that have fallen so violently they've embedded themselves into the ground, and there are still some people strapped into them who must have been killed upon impact. So she is so afraid to investigate and look because she's afraid that it's going to be her mom. And one of the first things she notices is there's a body there of a woman, and she sees that the woman has painted toenails. And she is almost instantly relieved because she knows her mom never painted her toenails, but that relief turns into immediate guilt and remorse. She's so sad and almost mad at herself for feeling relieved because here in front of her is a woman who is a victim. She perished from this horrible event. And it's striking to me because even in the face of all these things, she's surviving, she has all these injuries, she's trying to find her mom, she still had that human element where she felt terrible for the people who were victims of this horrible plane crash. So Juliane gathers what little she can from the wreck site and continues along with her plan to try to find water. So eventually she does find a stream, and she starts to follow that riverbank for a few days. Now, it's been days since the plane crashed, and with each passing moment she's getting weaker and weaker from lack of food, water, and nutrition. Not only that, but the wounds that she suffered, the cuts and lacerations, they are starting to get infected, and she even notices that some of these cuts, flies have laid eggs there, and the maggots now are burrowing into her flesh. So she is in a horrible situation at this point, and without finding anybody else or finding rescue, there is very little time she has left. But luckily for her, though, she does come across a work site. She comes across a boating site, and while there's nobody there, she does find some resources that probably did save her life. She actually finds some gasoline, and she pours the gasoline into her open wounds to rid herself of these parasites that were gouging into her flesh. And the extreme measures she took to survive is something that I think is absolutely unbelievable, but a testament to her will, her strength, and her conviction. After pouring the gasoline on her open wounds and getting rid of as many maggots and parasites as she can, Juliane passes out from exhaustion. She's now been in the jungle alone for 10 days. It's been 10 days since the plane crashed, and she is exhausted. There is very little she can do at this point. She hasn't had food, she hasn't had water, and she's almost at her end, and she passes out that night. The very next morning, she wakes up to hearing voices. There's actually people nearby, and I'm sure it was shocking in many ways because she's been alone for so long. To hear voices must have startled her, but she realizes that there are people. There's people around her, and they come across her, and they're just as shocked as she is because who's this young woman who's alone? Obviously, she's injured, and they give her food, they treat her injuries, and it's on this 11th day, 11 days after the plane crash, that Juliane is rescued. It's after 11 days of being alone in the jungle, surviving the plane crash, that Juliane is finally rescued, and she's reunited with her father, who is overcome with joy and emotion. They do continue their search for Juliane's mom, and they would find her body a few days later. She, along with everybody else on board, passed away from this horrible tragedy. Now, one of the things that stands out to me most, this is a terrible event. It is the most deadly lightning strike in history, but it's also a story of inspiration because of a young girl's resolve and her strength, and because of the family bond that she had with her mom, who remained a hero until her last moments. I hope you enjoyed this story of survival, courage, and bravery,
and I very much look forward to our next story that we can share together. Thanks so much for watching.